Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, those listening to us online and colleagues with me in the room at the ILO country offices in Lusaka. This is going to be a webinar about building resilient futures, social protection, and climate change. Just to give a bit of a background, so Zambia is this week commemorating what we call the Social Protection Week, which is basically an interesting time and opportunity for partners and the government in social protection to advocate for social protection policies, but also to bring to light some evidence in terms of what we are achieving in the implementation of social protection programs. The week is also used to bring to light new topics and potential areas of work, such as this particular session. So today, as part of Social Protection Week, this is being done in collaboration with UNDP, the country office in Zambia, and it's a hybrid roundtable meeting. The idea basically is to provide a comprehensive platform for discussion and blending various approaches regarding social protection and climate change. So I welcome you to enjoy this session. I'm going to briefly go through the program, and basically we will move step by step. We have time allocated to each activity. Just a reminder to especially colleagues online that this presentation is being recorded right now. And we have a Zoom AI-generated automatic captions which will be activated that colleagues online can utilize. This is how the interaction is going to flow. So we're basically going to do introductions quickly in 10 minutes, and then we are going to have presentations. We have 3 presenters that I'm going to introduce shortly, and then we have a discussion . Let me just go through some of the basic rules when it comes to interacting with Zoom. So participants are encouraged to use the chat box to present yourself. You introduce yourself briefly and make comments in the chat box. And then I encourage you to share your questions with the speakers using the Q&A. You're gonna see a Q&A tab on Zoom, and you're supposed to use it for questions and answers. Just to have a clear mission, the speaker at which your question is targeted. And then socialprotection.org is on X, former Twitter. So again, colleagues online, you're encouraged to use the hashtag SPOG webinar just to share thoughts and interactions as the session goes on. Briefly, I'm going to introduce the speakers. Apologies from the country director for ILO Lusaka, Mr. Wellington Chibebe, who's not joining us today. But we have in the online, we have Mr. James Wakiaga, who's the resident representative for UNDP Zambia as the co-host and organizer of this webinar. Mr. Wakiaga is going to give closing remarks at the end. And then there's myself, who's the moderator and the social protection expert here at the ILO in Lusaka. I have Mr. Lambo, Jean-Louis, who's the social protection manager and climate change expert in Lusaka, based in Lusaka right now, and with me in the boardroom. And then online, we have Gary Hack. Gary is a senior research fellow from Stockholm Environment Institute, based at York University. We have also David Stewart. David is a social protection and climate change financing expert based in New York at this time. After David, I have Jasmina Papa. Jasmina is a senior social protection specialist for our region here in Southern Africa, based in Pretoria at the moment and joining us online. So these 4 are basically going to give presentations, and then we are going to have reactions, and the reactions are going to come from colleagues that are working in Zambia. So I have the Assistant Director of the Green Economy and Climate and Environment Ministry, and his name is Hedges Tembo. Hedges is basically going to give a response to the presentations, bringing in the Zambian context to basically highlight what exactly is the Zambian government and different partners doing in this space. After that, we are going to have another reaction from Caro Zulu. Caro is the head of environment, energy and climate change based at UNDP here in Lusaka. Ladies and gentlemen, with that presentation and overview of the program, I'm now going to invite Mr. Lambo, who's going to provide an overview of this session and the topic and the reason why. Jean-Louis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will try to share my screen. You have to unshare, I think, and then I can share mine. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, while the audience is getting in the room, and let me briefly introduce the topic of today. So today we are going to talk about social protection and climate change, but not in any way, because we are here in Zambia. We are in a country that is currently under a drought emergency. So we feel very much what climate change impact can be, but we also have some colleagues that are working at global level. So obviously we will be able to link this global view with the global insight, with the local experience. So setting the scene. So very quickly, just to make sure that we are all on the same page, climate change is obviously coming from a question of, well, it's economic growth on the one end and energy use on the other. We know that if we put on the same graph energy and growth, you will have a line like in this graphic here, which I will share the link afterwards. So it's very clearly economic growth and production, industrial revolution, all these activities that man is doing to using energy to that has produced this climate change, this raising temperature. So very briefly, you can see that talking about energy, we know that fossil fuels are about to decrease very soon. However, we are still fighting at the moment to diversify of energy sources in order to pollute less. What does it mean? What are the implications? The carbon dioxide that are in the atmosphere is a persistent gas. That means that it's about 10,000 years for this gas that is causing most of the global warming to disappear. So that gives a time frame for climate change. Climate change is not about climate, it's about a long-term progression of climate. That's why this discussion today hopefully will put a stress on this long-time vision, because it's not going to go away. At the contrary, because we know that these fossil fuels, this polluting source of energy will go on for a certain time yet, and mitigation measures do not have an impact below 20 years. So this is a very long time frame that we have to take into consideration when thinking about climate change and its impact on the social background. So we have, on the one hand, global warming is going to go on for quite a while, and we have to mitigate it, but it's a long-term process. Though in the meantime, we have to adapt. So adapt is a cross-sectoral and multidimensional process. And the result of those two actions is called climate resilient development. It's a concept that was proposed by the Intergovernmental Climate Change Consultative Group. So what does it mean for social protection? Social protection will be present in all those dimensions. Social protection supporting climate change mitigation. This is very much what where the just transition concept is rooted. A labor movement originated idea or philosophy or desire to make sure that those shifts in energy and environmental and economical shift will not will not leave anyone behind, of course, but also that the profit and the benefits of those shifts will be shared fairly. So that's the first aspect of things. Mitigation, social protection is there to support those who are shifting from one sector to another. And we also try to, social protection also tries to foster a green economy. Altogether, it should be a vector of societal transformation. Adaptation, same thing. That's where probably the idea of resilience is more present. It's about, of course, protecting people from those climate risks, disasters, but also slow motion, erosive processes, covariate shocks, migrations, all these impacts on the people, on the vulnerable people, on people becoming vulnerable because of climate change. And last point, resilience is about also the systems. I mean that those systems, social protection systems, will be under stress. We can understand that more people will need coverage, and therefore the financial sustainability is really at the core of the reflection of social protection and climate change. Quickly, a very clear idea here. On the left, we have the climate risk in the World Risk Index in relation to climate. You can see that how Africa is appearing in red. That means that obviously one of the most exposed and vulnerable to the risk of climate change. And on the right side, you have the map of social protection coverage worldwide. And you can see again, Africa in red, very low levels of social protection coverage. What does it mean? It means that if you want people to be protected against climate change, well, you need to have everyone being covered by social protection as well. So there is an objective convergence between those two area of policy. Social protection policies and climate policies. They have to go together. And eventually I finish with this picture of one beneficiary of the social cash transfer in Zambia. So somebody who is typically very much exposed to climate change, but also extremely vulnerable in a living environment. So hopefully today's reflection will provide some answers for something that will build a positive climate resilient development. Over to you.
Thank you, Jean-Louis, for that brief overview, providing direction of this conversation. I'm basically amazed at the map that you share at the end, which shows that the least covered region in terms of social protection is also the worst hit in terms of climate change impact. We are now going to move to Gary, who's going to make his presentation. Let me again encourage participants that the chat is also there for you to share resources. So if there's a paper, if there's a link that you think is helpful to this conversation, please drop it in the chat. Gary, over to you.
Thank you and good day to everybody. And thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today about aging and climate change, which I think has already highlighted there is important when we talk about social protection. I'm Gary Hagg, a research associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute at the University of York in the UK. We've been looking at this intersection between aging and climate change since 2008, when we held our first workshop on, growing old in a changing climate. What was interesting back then, it wasn't really, not many people, at least in the kind of the aging area, was interested that much. And since then, we've progressed. So over the years, we've seen the impact that climate change is having on all of us, but particularly vulnerable groups such as older people. And just to say that this year, we've SEI, in collaboration with Help Age International, are holding a number of regional dialogues to understand the regional issues around aging and climate change. We held our first one in in May in the Asia Pacific region, and we're hoping to organize our next one in July in Africa. The global population is aging. I think by 2050, 16% of the global population will be aged 65 and over, and this will outnumber outnumber the children under the age of 5, and it's mainly women who outnumber men. Now, this has implications. We have an aging population. We have a changing climate. We know that not all older people are the same. Some people are very active, older people are very active and continue to work and in good health. But equally, we know that some older people suffer from disease and disability, and therefore they're vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And as we saw in the earlier slide about social protection and climate risk, it's those countries who don't have the adaptive capacity or the infrastructure in terms of health system are the ones who are going to suffer the most when it comes to the impact of older people, the effect of climate change on older people. Of the 28 African least developed countries, we'll expect a significant rise in the number of proportion of older people, and this is expected to triple by 2050. Therefore, there's an urgent need for healthcare, social protection, and policies that are inclusive and incorporate the voice of an aging population. And this decade is the UN decade of healthy aging. So when we talk about aging, climate change, it's about how we can protect older people from the impacts of climate change, but also how we can encourage healthy aging, which will hopefully build that resilience. But as we know, in old age, there are a number of threats with old age. Physical threats in terms of our declining health and exposure to disease, such as heart disease or cognitive decline. There's also psychological threats from issues such as isolation, bereavement, and economic vulnerability. And at the same time, there's environmental hazards, barriers to healthcare. So there already exist in old age threats like these: physical, environmental, psychological, and emotional. But then placing the impact of climate change and the extreme weather events on the existing threats in old age, then that's when you start to get issues, the big issues, if you like. And it's important to know that when we talk about the impacts of climate change, there's a direct impact, which is direct injury or death from flooding or heat exhaustion. But there are many indirect impacts that can affect older people. For example, if the transport system is flooded, there's no accessibility to healthcare, or if a storm damages the electricity supply, that is an issue for, say, medical appliances. So direct and indirect impacts affect older people, placing additional pressure on the threats they're already facing in old age. And when it comes to climate change in Africa, we know that Africa is disproportionately affected by climate change, as we saw in the first slide in the red area. In 2022, over 110 million people were affected in terms of deaths and fatalities from drought and flooding. There's effects on insecurity, and also potentially leading to resource conflicts around fuel, land, and water. So the climate is changing, the population is getting older, and therefore this increases potentially climate vulnerability of an aging population. And when we talk about climate vulnerability, we talk about the interaction between the exposure to an extreme weather event. This could be heat wave, wildfire, drought, storms, flooding, and heavy precipitation and rainfall. The sensitivity of the individual, if they already have certain physical needs, health needs, and their coping capacity. And this is not just their intrinsic coping capacity, it's their accessibility to social support, social protection, the kind of family, financial resources. So whether one person is able to deal with the threats of climate change, such as flooding or being evacuated, depends on the interaction of exposure, sensitivity, and coping capacity. And when we talk about social protection, it really is about looking at how it can, from a policy perspective, affect these three areas of interaction. This is a recent paper that was produced this year talking about heat stress and how high heat exposure for older adults by 2050 is going to be a big issue. And we've already heard this. In Asia, it's going to be 4 times higher, but in Africa, almost doubling. And again, if we do not have the adaptive capacity to deal with issues such as heat stress, due to lack of investment in infrastructure, cooling systems, or public health interventions, this means it's going to be a strain on the healthcare system, but also increases the vulnerability and risk to older people. So, as I said, we have aging, we have climate change, and then we have in this week social protection. So how are they all interconnected? As I said, a higher proportion of older people means a higher proportion of people who are potentially vulnerable to climate risk from greater health and mobility challenges, susceptibility to the impact on their health. This will mean that there's a greater demand on social services and healthcare. And in terms of the role for social protection, it's about how we can reduce the impact on older people from climate risk and extreme weather events, and how we can incorporate climate resilient policies in social protection policies. So this requires, therefore, a need for much more integrated, adapted social protection policies, and that emphasizes sustainability over the long term. And most of this kind of action will be community-based in the grassroots of building that local community resilience. And one way of doing this has been promoted by the World Health Organization is this concept of age-friendly citizen communities. And this covers a range of different components that promote healthy aging and are age-friendly, from housing, transport, outdoor spaces, community support, communication information, civic participation. All these aspects can promote healthy aging and can create age-friendly citizen communities. And I know there are a number of initiatives in Africa, such in Ghana, South Africa, and Kenya, that are addressing these issues. But all these aspects, which is not necessarily considered here, have to be resilient to the impacts of a changing climate. And that's why it's important to have, when we talk about, say, transport infrastructure, roads, and transport modes that are able to cope with extreme weather events. Same with housing that can be cool or in a heat wave, and how we can have those a kind of emergency response to deal with evacuation if there's a need to do so. So age-friendly community is one way of starting to build that kind of local community resilience for an aging population to promote healthy aging. But it's not just about old age, is it? It's about how we can arrive at old age. So when we talk about old age, we're talking about the people who are old now, but they've arrived there, and maybe when it comes to health or other aspects of their lifestyle and finance, is really the result of how they've progressed over their life course and all the interventions that's helped them to determine whether they are resilient now in old age or not. So while we talk about aging and climate change, we talk about resilience, we need to think about how we can build life course resilience across the life course, so that when you reach old age, you're reaching good health with the resilience, not only to deal with the potential impacts of climate change, but to deal with other social and economic kind of threats to an individual in later life. So taking this holistic approach to building life course resilience is important when we talk about resilience, climate resilience. As I said, it's easy to think about older people as vulnerable, only vulnerable to climate risk and climate hazards. But we must consider that, as I said, not every older person is the same. So we are going to have some very active and healthy people. So taking a more holistic approach, we've got to think about an aging population, not only the contribution they make to greenhouse gas emissions, going back to that issue of climate mitigation, but also adapting to climate change and reducing their vulnerability so they're no longer casualties. But at the same time, mobilizing the enormous wealth of experience and knowledge that they have in later life to be champions in climate action. So taking this much more holistic approach is important, which interacts with each other to support healthy aging. So with the focus of this presentation and this workshop is about building resilient futures. So in order to do that, we need to be aware of the increased vulnerabilities of our older adults face when it comes to climate change. That weak social protection exacerbates already existing health and livelihood threats. And that in order to develop policies, they have to be age inclusive and give a voice to older people. The World Health Organization framework provides one example of an age-friendly citizen framework, but that also has to be resilient to future climate change. And we really need to think about how we build lifelong resilience. And this is combining disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation, and social protection that fosters resilient and equitable communities throughout life. So going back to this diagram here about contributor, casualty, champion, we need to reduce the contribution of aging to greenhouse gas emissions. We need to protect older people from the impacts of climate change. And we need to mobilize the wealth and knowledge older people offer in climate action in order to build age-friendly and communities and promote climate action. On that note, I'd like to thank you. It was just a gallop through the issues, but hopefully it provides a background for discussion later. Thank you.
In the life cycle perspective, which shows that we are all destined for aging. I mean, we are all aging over time, and it's important that we have policies and interventions that prepare us for a healthy life in our old age. We are now going to move to David Stewart. Colleagues, I want to encourage that there's a Q&A coming, so let's just keep our questions and then we can ask after the presentations. David, you may take the floor.
Thanks so much, Felix. And to the presenters who went before, fascinating information and hopefully sets things up quite nicely. To be talking a little bit more about the role social protection can play in climate action, and then particularly digging in to the issue of climate financing, which is of course crucial to actually seeing action happen. Now, I just wanted to start with this sort of quote summary from the IPCC report, Climate Change Summary Synthesis Report, which is really sort of the Bible on where we are on the science on climate change and climate action. And they found that adaptation strategies do not sufficiently include poverty reduction and the underlying social determinants of human vulnerability, which is to say the focus that there is on adaptation tends to be focused on the infrastructural and the physical, which can itself have very important impacts on vulnerable communities, but is not necessarily directly tackling those vulnerabilities and poverty directly, and the poverty caused by climate change. And there's a really important role for social protection in this space. So I did a review of proposals from the Green Climate Fund, which is the biggest of the climate funds, to see how well integrated is social protection. Is this true? What the conclusion that came from the IPCC report? And actually, I think this graph is best read backwards. you can see on the right that of 37 reports that were approved in 2022-23, 9 have a general mention of social protection. There were 7 that would use a social protection instrument, but that would say that include a cash transfer or public works, but it would not be integrated to any system. It would be standalone. There were a couple which linked to social protection programs, but didn't strengthen them directly. And there was one that could be considered to have an element which was strengthening social protection. So this is really to show that social protection is in the conversation, but we're not seeing so much the money coming out of the wallets for strengthening adaptive social protection, climate ready social protection. So we face a gap. I just wanted to spend a moment looking at the connections between social protection and climate action. I come from social protection from a long-standing perspective. I've spent quite a lot of time on the climate action side. And one of the pieces which becomes, I think, clear is how misunderstood social protection can be. It's a term that everyone's comfortable with, but when you break down what it means, it becomes more confusing to people who aren't in the sector. And that clarity of what's included in social protection and how it relates to climate action is a really important piece of having clarity and understanding how the impacts can work. So I'm using here a very common way of breaking down social protection: social assistance, cash and public works, social insurance, which is contributory public insurance, social insurance, and then labour market interventions to support the transitions. And you can see here through these little grey lines how each of these areas can play a role in mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, the sort of fundamentals of climate action. But the piece I want to jump to is where you make social protection climate ready and adaptive. So this is sort of looking at a social protection system which isn't really considering risk, climate risk particularly. When you focus in on that climate risk and integrate it, what you see is a real strengthening of the relationships between what social protection can do to help achieve climate action. And it makes sense now because we're layering climate specifically in. Now, this is a bit of a spaghetti, which is hard to understand, but what's interesting are the particular relationships that we see across these pathways. So what I'm going to focus in on is the relationship between social assistance and when you layer social assistance with labour market support and the role that it plays in adaptation and loss and damage. And I think there's a real power in what adaptive social protection can do in these areas in the face of climate change. So to start with that, I just wanted to share what I find to be a very nice sort of diagram figure about building resilience and adaptive capacity and how that can strengthen through work. So when you look at the bottom left, you see absorptive capacity. So this is the ability to persist in the face of shock, say a humanitarian response that can just keep people going. Then as you expand outwards, you build adaptive capacity. So you're providing the support and the environment for people to incrementally change and adjust in response to the shocks that they're facing. And then over time, moving to transformative capacity, the ability to really transform how one makes a living, perhaps where one lives, in order to be able to cope with high levels of stress. So when we're looking at the role of adaptive social protection, we're looking at moving beyond just this persistence and the absorptive capacity towards greater adaptive capacity. And the example I wanted to share was an adaptive social protection program which is running in the Sahel. So at the core, social protection programs, social assistance programs, they can build the human and economic capital that underpins resilience. They give individuals, households, families that strength to be able to cope with change. And the design of the program in the Sahel has 3 approaches to it. So first, its reach is intended to those who are most exposed to climate change to be reached with cash transfer. So really focusing on where the program is going. The second is to layer that program, that cash programming, with additional programming that focused on building resilience and diversifying economic approaches. So it includes coaching and group formation, micro-entrepreneurship and life skills training, and then will include a lump sum grant to increase productive capacity or to shift productive capacity. So focused in that direction. And then finally, the program is designed to be flexible and resilient to scale up when there is a climate event, and so can raise the number of people who are receiving cash transfers, raise the scale of that cash transfer in order to respond to a shock. So it's sort of a loss and damage response, if you like. So this is sort of an example of how this can be packaged in one programmatic approach. So from here, I just want to pivot to what progress is there in integrating social protection and climate action and finance. So we have models, we already have social protection programs which are doing great work, and we have models in how we can make them adaptive. How can we finance them? And I think from a social protection perspective, there's a hope that the increasing financing that's going to come through climate can offer some really important opportunities for us to do that. So I wanted to start with this graph, which looks at the overall changes in annual climate financing of all forms over the years. And it paints a pretty positive picture of increased financing over time and an acceleration of that in the most recent years where there is data. So sort of a tripling over the course of 10 years or so, and just a whisper of an exponential curve that may be happening. So when one looks at this, it feels positive in terms of what available resources there might be. But it's also important to break that picture down into some of the buts that sit behind this bigger number, which I think are really revealing. So of this bigger number, we start on the left, about half of that finance is private and about half of it is public. If you look at how it's broken down between mitigation and adaptation, the great majority, over 90%, is focused on mitigation and not adaptation. And if you look at where the resources are going, you see the huge amount of resources are going to higher income countries, much less to emerging market and developing economies, and less still to LDCs. So herein lies a challenge, because ultimately, when we're talking about strengthening social protection systems, we're ultimately looking at public money that's adaptive, that's going to LDCs and other countries. So the numbers, the big numbers, are becoming smaller numbers. When we then look specifically at adaptation financing, so we're looking more at the relevant area. So adaptation financing going to developing countries, this is the story. And you see this positive shift through 2020, and then a bit of a fall off, which is really concerning. These numbers are in billions. So there's significant financing moving in this direction, but there's uncertainty about where it's moving from here. And on the right-hand side of this graph, I've included some of the gaps, which gives you a sense of where we have to go. So the overall adaptation gap globally is 387 billion. If you break that down for Africa, it's estimated at 46 billion. And if you look at social protection specifically globally, it's estimated at 16 billion. So a couple of points to make, I think. One, there's a massive gap between the money that's moving and the money that's needed. And that's really recognized. That's one of the consistent highest level points which is being made the whole time, that we need to close this gap, and it's essential it does get closed. It's interesting that social protection itself has been costed. This is like a positive sense of the realization of its role. I have a feeling this is a massive underestimate based on the way that number was developed. But at least it shows that there is some focus there. Now I just want to pause for a sec to say I'm not focusing here partly because of time on domestic financing. And of course, there are good reasons in a number of economies why that's extremely challenging when you look at what the debt burdens are and the limited fiscal space that there is. But at the same time, integrating social protection in domestic financing is really, really important. I mean, first of all, it gives a clear signal of what's actually a top priority. Domestic financing tends to be integrated into systems more effectively, more sustainably. And as we move through the course of development and hopefully growing economies, it will become ever more important. So that inclusion in domestic financing and that balance with international financing is really key. So a question is, how are we doing, and what can we do to integrate social protection more effectively into climate action and climate finance? Where are we? So in my mind, I really break this down into these sort of three categories. You have the global direction, so what's happening in the discourse and the IPCC reports and the big conversations that are happening out there about where things should move on climate. Then have the national commitments, where a country's moving and what a country's prioritizing. And then you have the guidelines and practice of financing institutions in terms of what they're going to be choosing to actually finance those sorts of realities. And this may be somewhat of a simplification, but I think it tells a picture, paints a picture of where we are. So on the global level, we see pretty good recognition of social protection. It's reasonably there. In the IPCC reports, it's there. The Global Goal on Adaptation includes a target on adaptive social protection. The Emerging Loss and Damage Fund, I think there's a lot of hope that that will include social protection. So there's good news there. When you look at the national commitments, it's a more mixed picture. I looked through all the nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, and you see social protection in 32 of 194 NDCs, 19 of 51 NAPs. About half of those you could determine as being actionable. Zambia does include social protection, the social cash transfer program, in both of these. It's a sort of one-off mention. In one of them, I think the NAPs, it mentions it in the context of floods, but not drought. So there's some bits of that which are interesting, but there's something there, even if it's not there in as full force as it might. And then when you look at the guidelines and practice of climate funds, there's much less there. As we saw at the beginning, lots of these funds are not currently supporting social protection in their funding. And I think there are exceptions here too. The multilateral development banks have much more focus on it. So there are areas where this is a more positive picture. So this is maybe slightly oversimplified. So I just wanted to end here with a couple of conclusions. And I've broken this down to some of the things that need to happen at the global level and actions at the national level, which can really be transformative, both nationally, but also in influencing the global level. So at the global level, we have to increase adaptation finance. Without that happening, there are going to be limits on where we can move. We need to recognize the role of social protection as part of adaptation and loss and damage in these evolving funding mechanisms. And I didn't talk about mitigation, but it has an important role to play there too. And then we need to get through the mechanics of integrating climate financing into the mechanisms of the climate funds, into the guidance, into the practice, into the pipeline. So we start seeing social protection programs coming out the other side. At the national level, a crucial starting point is to build the pillars of long-term adaptive systems as part of climate action. So adjusting and adapting social protection programs towards being climate ready in some of the ways that I've discussed, but there'll be many more too. Second is the integration of social protection in national climate thinking and in the frameworks. And I can't underemphasize how important the NDCs and the NAPs are. When something is in the NDCs and the NAPs, it becomes what climate financing is considered, and it will be taken at a global level as like, well, this is something that has to be prioritized. It's been prioritized at a national level. So getting the focus on these issues there is hugely important. And then finally, just to stress the importance of clear language and connections on climate action as I started. It's very easy for these communities to separate because we focus slightly in talking our own language and not focusing on these connections between social protection and climate action. So thank you very much. And with that, I will pass back and stop the share.
But that's another brilliant presentation and key issues highlighted on financing, and I'm deeply moved by the slide that shows that the needs, far outweigh, what's available and what's moving, particularly for African countries, So climate risks are increasing actually at a time when it's very difficult, especially to mobilize domestic resources, given debt crisis on the continent that are basically just making life difficult for governments and for people. So we can have more discussions on this, but what I'm going to do now is to have two reactions from colleagues based in Zambia. So I'm going to start with Carol from UNDP working in Zambia. I did provide a brief profile of Carol. Okay, great. I've just been reminded that Jasmina, who's an expert in labor and jobs within the ILO, has an intervention also. Jasmina, apologies for wanting to skip you, but please take the floor.
Thank you very much. And yeah, these things happen. So my name is Yasmina Papa. I'm social protection specialist in ILO, decent work team based in Pretoria. Thinking of some of the points that I want to make, they really relate to what was already said by Gary and David, but add perhaps additional dimension to it. So we can go to the next slide and just remind ourselves a little bit on the state of the social protection in terms of effective coverage globally. And that was in the period from 2020 to 2022. So we see that less than a half of global population is effectively covered with at least one social protection benefit. And there are huge variations among continents, with Africa having lowest coverage. That takes us back to Jean-Louis' slide, where he showed the convergence between impacts of climate change and social protection coverage. And it actually illustrates why social protection, adaptation, and mitigation is crucial in African context. Now, with that, I would like to share that ILO is finalizing a new World Social Protection Report, which will be published in September this year. And we will have the new information about coverage globally, continentally, and by countries. And I'm a little bit sad that I cannot share some of these new numbers, but the situation seems to be a tiny bit positive than it was in 2020. So with that, we can go to the next slide and look a little bit on what's happening in terms of effective coverage in Africa. And just like we have the global inequalities in terms of effective coverage, we can see the big differences in terms of coverage in different countries in Africa. And one could share relatively lay opinion that basically countries that need the protection most have the lowest coverage. So this is something to stress in terms of discussions around the climate change. And in terms of linkages between environmental and social protection policies. Very often we don't see these linkages coming out clearly. And this is something that could be pronounced more. What we see very often in a number of countries in Africa is that social protection policies make a reference to a need for them to be adaptive to climate shocks. But very rarely they go beyond that general observation into particular suggestions and measures of how this can be done. And this is surprising, given that there are grassroots practices, but also institutionalized practices, which already have some effects in terms of adaptation of the climate change. So we can go to the next slide. Yes, where we want to emphasize that the advocacy and support for building universal social protection is even more pronounced during transitions, be it the life cycle transitions from childhood to working age, from working age to retirement and older age, mature age, or during transition from informal to formal economy, or in terms of just transitions. So I think Gary has pointed out to a number of effects that climate change has on people in mature or older age. But let us also think of some of that are common to everybody. And this is the higher energy prices, higher food prices, availability of jobs, and the types of jobs that are being created during the just transitions. But there are also higher unemployment risks, especially in economies where there is a movement from brown sectors to green sectors. And one has to address the issue of unemployment protection in that context. But also in terms of older age, maybe something that really needs to be considered is a potential that the pensions will be lower because of more job insecurity that will be brought up by transitions in between brown and green jobs. But also other transitions. So these are some elements that are common throughout life cycle, and if the social protection is promoting the issue of intergenerational solidarity, then some of these elements that are considered in old age and negative adverse impacts of climate change in old age have to be considered by those that are younger or at the start of their working life. We can go to the next slide, please. One of the nexuses that we really want to tackle when we are discussing social protection in the context of just transitions is really the nexus between adaptation and mitigation, and how we move from very often considering the response to climate change from a perspective of pure shock, addressing pure shock, and moving to the programs which enable people to seize new opportunities offered by the green economy. And if you look at the current structure of the labor force, we always and the type of jobs where they are engaged, we often see that people who are currently engaged in jobs that are sort of green economy type, they are more likely to be excluded from tax-funded or social insurance mechanisms because they are engaged in the informal economy. So this is why making green economy jobs formal and decent is one of the priorities for action. And if we can go to the next slide, the interventions that would make these jobs decent and formal would have to have inbuilt insurance component in them, as well as really strong social unemployment insurance system. However, this is for the future. Even now, we need to think about protection in case of unemployment, and we know that this is one of the topics that is on the priority list of a number of countries in this region. And while countries are focusing on income security in case of unemployment, the other side and the link with services such as skills development, active labor market policies, and making skills development and active labor market policies responding to the labor market demands, particularly in case of green jobs, is going to become extremely important. The other element that we see as a priority is for the countries is linked with social health protection and other health services. Again, all these three components, so benefits, active labor market policies, skills, and health services, are very often considered in silos and separated from each other. While from the perspective of a worker, of a person who is looking for a job or has lost a job, all these elements should be and could be integrated. And for this integration, we need both strong institutions and sustainable financing. And this leads me to my last slide, where I actually would like to see whether during this discussion today, we could ponder some of the issues that we are looking at while we are drafting the new World Social Protection Report, which is focused on social protection and climate change. And they are about better alignment between environmental and social protection policies, particularly in Zambia and African context. And do we have good examples of delivering benefits, cash benefits and services that are breaking down the silos between them? And how can we use innovative financing mechanisms for social protection system financing? I think David has alluded to some of them, but maybe we can discuss them further. Thank you.
On time, I think very clear on the need to involve social protection in the just transition. I want to introduce Carol again. So Carol, you may take the floor and provide a discussion to the presentations. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Felix, and all the presenters that have spoken. Very insightful and really speaking to what is obtaining on the ground. And I just want to re-echo what Luis had mentioned, to say resilient development actually requires anticipatory actions, and that is what will be termed as adaptation. But the bottom line that I wanted to draw from the presentations, especially what Gary spoke to, is that climate change has varied effects on society. And those varied effects are because there's a varied adaptive capacities across populations. And this is why it requires that at country level, for example, in Zambia, speaking to the policies and instruments that have been developed to address climate change, we require that climate change vulnerability is defined in form of criteria for society. The question of whom are we looking at as vulnerable communities when we talk about the aged. I see the presentation on the aging population, but in that aging population, we have a mix of people that are aged and retired, so they have better adaptive capacity. And we have those that are aged but have never been employed, and they rely on social cash transfer, for example. So the adaptive capacity is varied, and we need processes that can identify those that are really critically vulnerable. When we talk about vulnerability criteria, again, to look at female-headed households, the question is, there could be women who are in employment, but they are heading households, and there could be men who are not in employment. They could be widowed and really vulnerable compared to counterparts. So my point is to have a very clear definition of vulnerability criteria that can inform how social protection is delivered to speak to climate change vulnerability and be able to have this intersection addressed. At country level, I want to speak to opportunities that are available to integrate both climate change and social protection. And I mentioned the social cash transfer, the constituency development fund. We have weather index insurance, but I think what we require are processes that can enable at local level a screening to be able to identify how each of these can integrate climate change responses. If we look at social cash transfer, for example, that has been provided in the country and increased in the face of the drought emergency that the country is going through at the moment. This is reactory, and you find that the amounts being provided are not actually addressing the key basic needs, but going towards responding to a climate change emergency. And so you find that the social protection measures being put in place are being overtaken by events because the systems are not anticipatory. When we look also at adaptation measures that are being defined in the national determined contribution for the country, the question is how coordinated are these with institutions that drive social protection? And I go to what James normally will say, if you're not at the table, you're at the menu. And you find that when you miss social protection, integration in climate change measures, be it adaptation or mitigation, we miss it then in project development, as David had mentioned, and that's what dictates what kind of financing the country gets. So I think what I would also identify from the presentations is how adaptation and mitigation measures are designed with the lens of vulnerable populations, for example, the aged. If adaptation measures require labor intensity, they require populations to contribute some cash or some form of contribution. The question is, who is able to do that? So for climate smart agriculture sometimes require labor intensive activities, and the aged people are the ones we also want to target to be able to respond to such measures. So you find that populations that are able to get involved in implementing adaptation measures become also the vulnerable ones when it comes to labor intensity and contribution of finance. I also want to speak to the issue of how pension and insurance products are structured to ensure that they tailor to emerging vulnerabilities. I heard what Gary had mentioned to the extent that emerging or projected climate effects, for example, heat waves, are likely to impact different populations, different sections of populations. And so the question is how the country then can respond and tailor pension and insurance as social protection instruments reacting or responding to such projected climate impacts. And so it requires that, I think, at country level, policies and instruments that are addressing climate change and social protection with their responsive measures are screened. And this is an inevitable process, but quite time-consuming and requires resources on its own. But inevitable in the way it is, we require that safeguards are provided in the way social cash transfers, social insurance, drought responses are designed and be able to be proactively responding to anticipated climate projections. And here I go back to what science says. So we do have countries receiving IPCC reports, but quite technical and highly scientific, and not able to be translated to inform how social protection instruments are designed. So the science is telling us what we anticipate in 30 years to come, but are the policies on insurance and social protection in general responding likewise, such that those that are vulnerable and requiring to respond or to be cushioned are provided with such services in a timely manner. So these are my reflections from what I've picked out from the presentations, and I'm really happy that the topic actually speaks to us looking forward to be able to do a bit more work when it comes to, for example, screening what the National Determined Contribution revision process is going to be, and being responsive to engage and coordinate with institutions that are dealing with social protection. So I'll end here, Felix, and allow other reflections to come on board. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Caro. I think you've summarized the issues well. We are now going to move to the final reaction by Assistant Tembo. Colleagues, I have two postings in the Q&A, so please, if there are more questions, let's have them there and then they can be addressed. Mr. Tembo, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Moderator. Just to recognize the various protocols that need to be observed, and just to indicate that this is a very important topic. I think previously, as government, we did not link social protection to climate change. We didn't do a good job of linking social protection to climate change. Although I would say that in terms of implementation of interventions, when you look at the interventions that are being implemented, they are those that are targeted at the most vulnerable in our society. So what I would like to indicate from the aging and social protection presentation, the presentation on climate finance and social protection and integrating labor matters in social protection, is that I think this is a conversation that is timely. It is a conversation that will inform further mainstreaming of social protection in our policies, in our enabling environment, so that we begin to implement climate change interventions with the social protection lens. So this is very important. But just to react, to indicate that even as I have acknowledged that government is only beginning or has started mainstreaming of social protection in climate change interventions and vice versa, of climate change interventions in social protection, I think we have also done a lot of work. We have formulated a number of policies, the National Policy on Climate Change, the Nationally Determined Contributions that Madam Zulu alluded to, the National Green Growth Strategy, which specifically actually mentions the issue of social protection in building resilience of our communities to the impacts of not just climate change, but environmental matters. So we also looking at the aspect of involvement of various stakeholders, particularly the stakeholders that have been identified as vulnerable in the process of formulation of policies, but beyond that, in the implementation of the various policies and measures, either on adaptation or resilience building. And we have various fora, for example, community natural resource boards in the rural areas. We have at national level, the cluster advisory groups. We also have the National Development Coordinating Committee that have representation from civil society organizations that advocate for the mainstreaming of social protection in policies. But we also looking at mobilization of financing. As you know, you cannot pour water from an empty can. So we need to mobilize resources so that we are able to effectively design interventions, but also implement those interventions effectively. So the Green Climate Fund, we are developing a readiness proposal, but also country program informed by a needs assessment that also caters to matters of social protection. So we are also looking at adaptation financing. As clearly alluded to in the presentation, adaptation financing is lagging. The adaptation gap is huge. What do we need to do in order for us to bridge that gap? I think we need innovative measures, for example, involvement of the private sector and ensuring that there's blending of financing from both the private sector, the public sector. We're also introducing carbon financing in the implementation of measures on resilience, but drawing from mitigation actions as core benefits from mitigation actions. So I thought I mentioned those aspects, and once again to just thank ILO and the UNDP for convening this webinar. It's very important, as I have already indicated. Social protection needs to be advocated for in order for it to be included in climate change policies, and vice versa. In order for us to include climate change in social protection measures, we also, as the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment and as government, need to make sure that we agitate for the inclusion of climate change in social protection policies and measures. Thank you so much, Moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Tembo. Quite clear, you know, that I think Zambia is only beginning now to link social protection and climate change, and this webinar should be, you know, obviously presents an opportunity for justification of policy to start moving in that direction. We don't have a lot of time left, so what I'm going to do now is I have about 3 or 4 and I see that Gary has attempted to provide responses to the questions. So Gary, maybe in summary, do you just want to go over the questions you've responded to from Mamadou, which is talking about, you know, cultural issues in Africa as far as old people are concerned. So they are important in society, and culturally there's a way we should take care of the aged. So how do we combine modern approaches of social protection and climate change? And then there's another one from Andrew. Andrew is a Zambian academic who recently completed his PhD on aging, and is basically saying, how do we ensure an adaptive setting for the well-being of older persons, considering the local elements in communities, particularly in the rural communities, using community-based resources? So Gary, you may want to briefly highlight those. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the questions. In terms of integrating traditional knowledge or local culture, I think this is a key part of when we talk about climate adaptation and resilience, is how you can incorporate that knowledge in the community within any kind of policy. And this goes back to what I was saying about giving a voice to older people and other kind of disadvantaged groups, and how it actually is involved in social protection schemes. I think, and I don't know if others can answer this better, but I was just thinking about, obviously it's recognizing that the kind of traditional knowledge about caring for older people is important, and that this should be recognized when designing these kind of policies on social protection. But I guess another part is about raising awareness of the needs of older people during extreme weather events. And the part of the question was on about studies on local cultural care, which I didn't know. So my response to that is that Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge is important. This kind of community-based knowledge is important, but it has to be recognized, and it has to be given an opportunity to be involved in developing appropriate social protection policies, and in some ways co-designing them. And then the second question was about this resilient life course is important. How do we ensure adaptive setting for the well-being of older persons? I think what Carol was saying earlier is that I think what we're moving towards is the kind of, when we think about adaptation for all of us, climate adaptation, kind of one solution doesn't fit everybody at different life stages. So I think it's having this kind of thinking about life course adaptation. What do people need at different stages of their lives? But also, how do we build that resilience in the community and in place? And this is about mobilizing what we call community assets. This is just not just the resources in the local community, physical, in terms of like building structures, or, for example, kind of community centers, but also how do we mobilize the kind of more soft social aspects of community assets, such as knowledge, volunteering, and support. So I think it requires that kind of community approach in order to support healthy aging in place, and that's where most of the kind of recommendations are going towards that. So that's my quick response. With the first one, I don't know if any of the people from social protection background could add anything to what I've already said. Thank you for the questions.
Thanks, Gary. The other question is from Muyatwa, who says that most social protection programs in Zambia are not shock responsive, and this is why climate shocks tend to have disastrous effects on poverty interventions. He says, I wish to find out if you know of any countries that have mainstreamed shock responsive strategies in social protection programs to address climate shocks. David, do you want to make an attempt? You can even approach this from a financing angle. Over to you.
Yes, yeah, happily. No, it's a great question, and it has an important financing angle to it. So there are a number of countries that have taken this approach forward. The countries in the Sahel were an example that I gave, that have a program which is really integrating for a shock response when there's a climate event. And a couple of things that they're doing in order to make that happen are ensuring that there's ready financing, including government commitment. So when something is triggered, it's the financing comes in, but also having flexible databases so more people can be reached very rapidly in the event of a shock. And there are other countries also. Ethiopia has a long-standing program which scales up during climate events. Philippines is also a very interesting example, and they've really pushed forward on the anticipatory action. And I think that there's a really interesting coming together of themes at the moment. There's a very big global push towards early warning systems for all. And one of the things that you're seeing across the climate funds actually is a real push for all countries to have climate information and early warning systems. And the fourth pillar of an early warning system approach is to actually be ready and responsive. And this is where there can be really important links between the social protection system and the early warning system, and breaking these sorts of silos, being at the table in the way that we were talking about, because then you have that sort of parametric trigger. Something's happened, a threshold's been reached, and we can pay out. There are a number of challenges though as well, because I think the question also said, what are some of the lessons learned? It requires very strong coordination and integration between different parts of government and institutions, which aren't always in place, and the readiness of financing in order to quickly scale up. So you need sort of a pool of resources that can be rapidly tapped on. So those, I think, are some of the examples, some of the lessons learned. But it's a very, very important way to move forward. And I would just say one final separation. I think it's important we think of social protection programs, and maybe I'm thinking mostly of social assistance programs, in two ways as we think about climate. One is shock responsive. There are going to be events that happen, and we need to be able to respond and stop those negative coping mechanisms and the disastrous consequences they can have. So it's a responsive approach. The program has to be prepared to do it. The other is the adaptive approach. So before things are happening, how can we be supporting individuals, households, families to build that adaptive capacity and resilience so they're ready, they're in a better shape in terms of their human and economic situation to be able to respond. And social protection programs can play both of these roles if they're built in the right way to do it. And maybe just one final reflection based on some of the comments is, like, I think there's a question of sort of where to get started. And there is a challenge with social protection programs tend to be quite low coverage, as I think we saw in Yasmina's presentation. But even though they're low coverage, they're high coverage compared to a lot of what you see happening in terms of climate funds. I mean, often when you see programs going through climate funds, you're reaching hundreds, maybe thousands of people with an intervention. Social protection programs, even when we're working to scale them up, tend to be working on the tens, hundreds of thousands of people with the room to be able to grow. So they're quite a powerful starting point for the sort of scaled response that we need to climate. Back over to you, Felix.
There's a question for you, and I would like you to address it in a minute because we will have to close the session shortly. Muyata wants to know specific examples of attempts you've undertaken to integrate climate strategies in social protection programs. Any specific examples and interventions? That's a very specific question.
Okay, thank you so much for that question, Muyatwa. So we have integrated social protection programs there's an intervention that we are implementing in Luapula, Northern, Muchinga, and Eastern Province called the Transforming Landscapes for Resilience, the Resilient Development. It covers 16 districts in those 4 provinces. And what we have done is that we have ensured that we integrate social protection measures with the climate intervention. So that's a climate adaptation intervention. So we are integrating that climate adaptation intervention with the social protection measures, working together with the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we hope that we could have more of those. I'm just going to provide a conclusion and to say, before I invite Mr. James Wakiaga to give the closing remarks, that this has been an interesting session and we hope to have more, for the reason given by the Assistant Director that Zambia is actually just beginning to link social protection and climate change. So Gary's presentation highlighted that the globe is going to grow older in a few years. And as that happens, climate risks are also growing. So there's need to develop a life cycle approach where as we grow towards our old age, we reach there, healthier than we are now. In terms of financing, there's a huge gap, and apparently there seems to be more concentration on mitigation interventions and less of adaptation. And Yasmina raised the issue and the need to ensure these transitions are just, so jobs are protected, benefits are provided to those that are victims, for lack of a better term. And I liked Carol's intervention, which basically highlights and links strongly to David's presentation that take the cash transfer, for instance, in Zambia, whatever you are providing, the values are not sufficient and they are all being consumed, trying for people to address climate-related risks, which was not the initial intention. So when cash transfers are planned in Zambia, they are not climate sensitive. So we are giving an amount to support people's livelihoods, and then there's a shock that just makes the transfers insufficient. And then our government official has indicated clearly that Zambia is just beginning this journey. And I would like to report that myself and Jean-Louis has supported the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment to, basically develop the green economy strategy, just to ensure that social protection needs are reflected. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, I'm now going to invite Mr. James Wakiaga, who is the UNDP rep in Zambia, to provide a closing remark. Sir, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felix, and thanks for that excellent moderation. And let me also begin by, of course, recognizing valuable points of discussion that have been raised by the speakers from Jasmina, Caro, Gary, as well as David. And of course, thanking Jean-Louis and UNDP colleagues for jointly holding this important webinar and roundtable. And of course, it could not have come at a better time, especially at a time when Zambia is experiencing adverse impacts of climate change, including the current drought situation, which has since been declared a national disaster. So really, for me, is to appreciate all the speakers for bringing to the fore important deliberations, both at global and local level, particularly on the social protection, climate financing, as well as looking at how do we implement climate resilient development. Of course, advancing what has come to be dubbed as a whole of society approach to accelerate adaptation and mitigation. And of course, for us on the ground, we really look at these efforts as part of accelerating adaptation as well as mitigation and looking at ways on how do we support government to mobilize both public and private finance to implement their adaptation priorities. Let me touch a bit on some of the issues that have come up as well. And of course, reminding the meeting that the context of poverty, vulnerability, and risk does illustrate the important role of social protection in protecting the poor and vulnerable people. But of course, reducing their exposure and vulnerability at the same time through building climate resilience from a holistic and multidimensional approach. And I think speakers have all touched on that. And for me, I think the point coming home is the need for us to be deliberate towards building more resilient communities at social, at community level, as well as financial capacities that will be enable them to cope and recover from the impacts of the climate change. Jean-Louis touched a bit on the issue of the just transition. And we all know that just transition has taken a center stage in the climate action discourse. And in a sense, it means investing more in green economy and protecting those affected. And so to a large extent, we all agree that Zambia has begun to pivot towards social protection that is climate resilient. And of course, this event and this webinar does bring the point even closer home. And therefore, by way of highlighting what we've heard today, I think the increase in risk from climate change and disasters will imply that assets, livelihoods, and well-being of the poor will become even more vulnerable. And thus, this may require solutions to reduce the current and future vulnerabilities of the poor and the marginalized within the context of climate change and disasters. Thinking through on how do we strengthen adaptive capacities? How do we enhance, for example, residual risk management support for them to be able to recover from some of these hazard-related shocks, which for purposes of Zambia, where we are operating, of course, we know the damage caused by the floods. We know also the current drought shocks. And all these events do require collective action in a more sequenced and nuanced approach. And again, it allows us to bring a positive momentum. I think this event does bring a positive momentum and a shift towards bringing convergence between social protection and climate resilience. And so for me, again, is how do we ensure that the adaptation strategies do address poverty and social determinants of vulnerability, which have become important, are also addressed. In a sense, the importance of integrating social protection in GCF and JEF, as alluded by Stewart in his presentation. And some of the takeaway points, the issue around adaptive social protection. For me, I think this is a point we need to see how do we carry it forward, particularly when you look at integrating social protection in our own GCF and JF proposals, particularly on climate mitigation, the NDCs and the NAPs. How do you ensure that they are all part of the national action towards bridging the gap between social protection and vulnerabilities that are caused by the climate change? Jasmina highlighted on the issue of the green jobs creation and of course, emphasizing the importance of how we ensure positive externalities in the case of the unemployment. And so green jobs, in a sense, tend to provide this kind of support. And also alluding to Carol's idea on really looking at how do we structure some of the pensions and the need for some of these pension funds to be able to respond to the vulnerabilities. And possibly is for us to begin thinking, for example, how we could leverage on pensions to structure some of the climate financing instruments that could deliberately target the vulnerable. And of course, we know the Zambia experience already on the crop insurance, and I think there's also possibility on looking at how we also tap on some of these pension funds to de-risk investments around this kind of financing instruments. I didn't hear much from the speakers in terms of looking at targeting people living with disability, for example, or being deliberate on women agenda within this context. Unless maybe I missed it, but again, I think it's important also to keep this in view as we look into framing some of these responses on the nexus of the social protection and climate action. So Felix, in conclusion, let me conclude with a reminder that adopting resilience thinking within the climate adaptation projects and policies does, of course, encourage a shift from the short-termism, incremental and more project-focused, and so really moving away from these reactive approaches towards a kind of planning that is long-term, more transformative, holistic, and forward-looking. It is therefore expected that many more of these kind events should be held in the future, more brown bags, and let's bring Gary, let's bring everybody, Stewart, once again to share the ideas with us as we shape the future and promote dialogue, sharing some of the best practices, and of course, providing the much needed technical knowledge to develop a climate resilient society. So thank you again, and big thumbs up to all the speakers and of course to the participants. This could not have happened without your participation, and of course to Jean-Louise and the team, big kudos. Thank you very much.
That is a clear consolidation of the issues. And let me just again thank all the presenters and the online audience, as well as colleagues with us in the room. Please make sure to answer our survey available when you leave the session and join us for the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.